colleagues. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. Welcome to the final day of our conference on regulatory frameworks for solar deployment and integration in African power sector. Over the past 2 days, we have examined the state of play, explored regulatory barriers, and discussed integration measures and institutional challenges. Today, our objective is to consolidate these insights and define a credible strategic direction for the future. Before we move into the last session, it's important to reflect clearly on what has emerged so far. And to help us synthesize the discussions from the previous 3 panels, I'm pleased to invite Mr. Notifafa, our Senior Training Associate and also the Training Director, to provide a summary of the key themes, open issues, and lessons identified over the last 2 days. Mr. Notifafa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Keno. Thank you, distinguished colleagues, panelists, partners, ladies and gentlemen. As we transition to panel 4 today, allow me to briefly step back and reconnect our discussions to the central theme of this conference. And the theme is regulatory frameworks for the deployment and integration of solar energy in the power sector of African countries. This theme has guided every intervention, every debate, and every reflection over the past 2 days, and they were very interesting. Today, before we move into our final panel, a call to action. It is very important that we synthesize what we have learned and clarify the path forward. Why this conversation matters? Africa stands at a defining moment. We possess some of the richest solar resources in the world. That one, there's no doubt about it. But electricity demand is expected to move to more than double by 2040. But over 600 million Africans still lack access to electricity. Technology costs have fallen dramatically, and yet, despite these advantages, solar deployment still remains far below its potential. This gap between potential and reality is not primarily a resource problem. It is not even mainly a technology problem. It is fundamentally a regulatory and institutional challenge. Regulation determines whether investment flows or stalls, whether grids are prepared or constrained, whether contracts are bankable or risky, whether solar competes fairly or faces structural barriers, whether integration strengthens systems or destabilizes them. This is why our focus has been on regulatory frameworks, because regulation is not a technical afterthought. It is a foundation of scale. In day 1, we understood the landscape. We discussed about the solar landscape. On day 1, we began with realism. We examined the state of play of solar PV in Africa. We recognized opportunities. There is abundant land and solar irradiation, rapidly declining technology costs, increasing interest from DFIs and private investors, emerging regional power pools, political recognition of the energy transition imperative, but we also confronted serious barriers, such as regulatory gaps. These are unclear or inconsistent licensing frameworks, lengthy permitting processes, weak enforcement of grid codes. We also encountered procurement challenges, non-transparent tendering processes, limited competition in the energy markets, weak contract enforcement. We also had grid constraints, that's inadequate transmission infrastructure to evacuate power from the resource centers to the demand centers, curtailment of risk, limited system flexibility. We also had financial risks, that's related to currency volatility, off-taker payment delays, high cost of capital, weak credit enhancement mechanisms. That's not all. We had other challenges related to policy uncertainty. That's changing support schemes, absence of long-term renewable targets, weak integrated resource planning. And panel one made one thing very clear. It made it clear that Africa does not lack solar resources. We have them in abundance. What Africa lacks is sufficiently predictable, coherent, and confidence-building regulatory environment. That diagnosis set the stage for day two. So in day two, we move from diagnosis to solutions. And in day two, we had two panel sessions. In panel one, discussed removing regulatory barriers. In panel two, we asked, how can regulation move from being an obstacle to becoming an enabler? We explore reforms such as streamlining licensing and permitting processes, implementing transparent and competitive procurement mechanisms, designing bankable power purchase agreements, strengthening regulatory independence, reducing administrative discretion, improving coordination between ministries, regulators, utilities, and investors. The key insight here was that investment responds to predictability. Predictability is very clear to attract investors. Developers and financiers do not fear regulation. They fear uncertainty. Good regulation reduces risk. Reduced risk lowers the cost of capital. Lower cost of capital makes solar competitive and scalable, as well as sustainable. So that was the end of panel two. And in panel three, we discussed ensuring reliable and efficient integration. Panel three addressed a crucial point. Deployment without integration is incomplete. Solar must not only be built, it must be absorbed reliably into the power systems. In that panel, we also discussed grid planning and transmission expansion, system flexibility and balancing mechanisms, market design adjustments, clear technical standards, curtailment management, and regional interconnection through power pools. This panel highlighted that integration is both a technical challenge and a regulatory design challenge. System operators need clear rules. Utilities need proper incentives. Markets need flexibility mechanism. And regulators must ensure fairness, cost-reflective, and reliability. Integration requires foresight, not reaction. So what are the emerging cross-cutting themes in all this panel? Across all panels, several key messages have emerged. One, regulation must be stable. That is non-negotiable. Frequent policy reversals undermine confidence. We tend to scare away the investors. Regulation must be transparent. Clear rules reduce discretion and corruption risk. Regulation must be coordinated. Energy policy, finance, planning, and grid operation cannot operate in silos. 4, regulation must be forward-looking. Planning for 2030 and 2040 cannot rely on framework designed for fossil-dominated systems. 5, capacity building is critical. Even the best design frameworks fail without institutional capacity. This conference itself is evidence of that need. And capacity building is very key for us on this continent because of our peculiar situation. We don't need to import technology. We don't need to import ideas, regulation. We need to adapt them to our environment. And that's what the ASR is positioned to do, to build capacity in best practices that are implementable on the continent. So the broader question, as we now turn to panel 4, we must elevate the discussion. It is no longer just about identifying these barriers. It is no longer only about fixing isolated regulatory weaknesses. It is no longer solely about grid codes or procurement design. The real question is, what comprehensive long-term regulatory vision will enable Africa to scale solar sustainably and reliably? We must think beyond projects. We must think beyond short-term tenders. We must think beyond donor cycles. We must think systematically. So panel 4 challenges us to move from analysis to commitment. And that will be the input of today's discussion. Moving from analysis to commitment, moving from pilot to deployment. That's what we are going to look at this afternoon. Keno, I hand back to you the floor. That's the synthesis of the 2 days of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Notifafa, for that comprehensive summary of the previous 3 sessions. We now move to panel 4, which is designed as a call to action, as Mr. Notifafa has also mentioned. If the first 2 days helped us understand the challenge and possible regulatory response, this session asks us a broader question. What must change for solar deployment in Africa to move from incremental progress to sustained system-level transformation? This discussion will focus on long-term regulatory credibility, investment signals, institutional coordination, and strategic alignment. It's my pleasure to invite back once again the moderator of the session, Mr. Notifafa, to take us through this panel. Thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, welcome. Thank
How are you?
We are good. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Notifafa, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Kedo, for the invitation to moderate this important session. It is actually a privilege to be part of this discussion. We started 2 days ago. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are joining us from, colleagues, participants, and distinguished panelists. A warm welcome to everyone to panel 4, which is a call to action. In this panel, we'll be looking at what works, what can be improved, and the need for a comprehensive and a long-term vision. My name is Notifafa Kojo Fiasobo, Director of Training at the African School of Regulation. It is a pleasure to moderate this final session of what has been a very rich and engaging conference. Over the past 2 days, we have explored Africa's extraordinary solar potential, the regulatory and financial barriers that remain, and the measures required to enable large-scale deployment and reliable integration. We also discussed the procurement frameworks, grid integration challenges, investor risks, and the importance of regulatory capacity. So since I've already synthesized what we've discussed over the 2 days, I'll just jump straight. With this context in mind, I look forward to a strategic and action-oriented conversation with our distinguished panelists. That's 1, Mr. James Banda, Technical Manager, African Forum for Utility Regulators. 2, we have Ms. Florencia Agatiello, Chief of Staff of RELP. We also have on this panel Mr. Alexander Hodgpin Rata, Manager, Research and Diligence Unit, Third Derivative. We also have Mr. Yaguba Traore, Head of Policy, African Energy Commission, AFREC. We also have Mr. Kalist Kambanda, Manager for Energy Policy, African Development Bank. Thank you all for joining us. We are very pleased to have such a distinguished and diverse group of perspectives on this panel. Thank you all. Okay, let me quickly begin. I'll begin by inviting each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share their initial reflections on the big picture shift. That is, if Africa is to move from isolated solar projects to true system-wide transformation, what is that one fundamental change that must happen? That's the question. What is that one fundamental change that must happen? I will give the opportunity to Florencia, because at the African School of Regulation, we are gender inclusion is not just a checkbox, it's something we truly value. And since she's the only lady on the panel, I want to start with her.
Thank you very much, Nutifafa, for those kind words, and thank you, the African School of Regulation, for the invitation. It's a really pleasure to be here with you. Let me introduce myself very briefly. I'm Florencia Gatiello. I'm the Chief of Staff at RELP, a nonprofit organization that provides support to governments across the developing world to design and implement renewable energy procurement programs. I'm an economist, and I was part also of the government of Argentina before this position. I was part of the team that designed and implemented the Renovar program in Argentina that enables the installation of roughly 11 gigas of 9 gigas of new energy, renewable energy capacity, and more than 11 billion investments in just 3 years. So it's a great honor to be here with you. And about the initial question, I would start saying that I think the challenge is not only to gain scale, but also to do it at affordable prices for the communities without compromising sovereignty or power system security. And I emphasize especially this because a country can gain scale very easily through a bilateral negotiation with a single company for a 3 giga project, just to say, like many African countries have already done. But the question is at what price for the people, the system, and the government, right? So, because this kind of transaction usually create a high fiscal exposure to governments that already have very narrow fiscal spaces. So actually, many of those projects were announced very enthusiastically, but unfortunately, they haven't reached COD, many of them yet, and we don't even know if they will ever be online, right? So I would say that the short answer to the initial question is that transitioning to competitive bidding is the first essential condition for scaling renewables at competitive prices for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Florencia. That's interesting. You are pointing out that tariffs have to be cost reflective and competitive. That's very good. I think I'll turn to Mr. Kalist Kambanda. Can you share your thoughts on this?
Thank you very much, moderator. And I use the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Karixte Kambanda, Manager for Energy Policy Regulation and Statistics at the Africa Development Bank. And also I thank Africa School of Regulation for inviting me to this important webinar. Yes, to your question, the fundamental change that may be needed, I would say from the experience we have and in elaborating the Electricity Regulatory Index report whereby we benchmark regulatory authorities of over 40 countries in Africa. The key bottleneck regulators are facing, or the regulatory environment in Africa is facing, is really the independence of the regulators, the regulatory authorities. So I think the fundamental change will need to provide a certain autonomy to the regulatory authorities of African countries. Another point that goes together with this one, particularly considering across the regions or at continental level, we need harmonization of regulatory frameworks. And I'm very happy to mention here that the Africa Development Bank is assisting all the regional regulators to harmonize the regulatory frameworks between the regions, but also across the regions to achieve this harmonization, possibly at a continental level, where while we are looking at having the Africa single electricity market. And overall, we need the political will. So in a nutshell, this is those three key areas I want to mention to respond to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kabanda. Yes, you are touching on independence of the regulator, how we can insulate them from political interference, and also harmonization of the regulatory frameworks on the continent. Thank you. May I call on Mr. Yaguba Traore? Kindly introduce yourself and share your thoughts on this point.
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. Yaguba Traore is my name. I'm the head of policy planning and strategy at the African Energy Commission. First of all, let me take the opportunity to thank and also congratulate African School of Regulation and together with the International Solar Alliance for convening this very important webinar and also for inviting us to provide our reflection on the discussion. Actually, I must say that listening at the discourse of the 3 past day discussion, I believe that we have no option than taking advantage of the solar resources that we have on the continent, and so that we can address our energy challenge, poverty, while striving to ensure the energy security for the continent. I think one thing that I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion is that we must move from a kind of opportunistic behavior to a more kind of least cost power system planning. And that in doing so, I believe that we need to ensure that we move from regulatory uncertainty to a kind of a rule-based governance. That means that the system level transformation, as we all know, require a kind of stable rule-based regulatory frameworks. So I would like to particularly support what Mr. Kabanda has just said, because we need to ensure that independent regulators must be empowered in Africa, and that they are also protected from any political interferences, so that they can do their job adequately. And the focus should be shift from discretionary decision making to a more transparent and codified, clear process, actually, that will provide a very clear environment for every player to play its role. I think that's really that coordination at among government institutions within the country, but also across the region, is what we need to strengthen to ensure that to ensure that we have a kind of long-term planning process to address the challenges, and to also to have a more scalable project implementation across the different countries, but across the region. So I think we need to ensure that we have that clear rule-based governance of our energy system on the continent. Yeah, let me stop there for now. Yeah, Chair.
Thank you. But we've touched on least cost power system, prices, regulatory certainty, clear processes, coordination among institutions, and scalability and sustainability of our investment. And those are very key, in my view, to transitioning successfully to renewables. Thank you. We'll proceed with Mr. Alexander, can you share your thoughts? Kindly introduce yourself first and give us your thought on this question.
Yes, I'm Alex Hogovine-Rutter. I work with Third Derivative. We're part of RMI, so I've got a lot of colleagues working in Nigeria and East Africa. Hopefully you've encountered some of them working on various initiatives. Now I'm mostly on South and Southeast Asia, but this region is very, very close to my heart as well. I think there's a lot of different things folks can do. I'm least cost resource planning is kind of my area of specialty, and I could talk about that for ages. So I'm glad the previous speaker mentioned that. But I think if I had to list one thing, I think it'd be doing less. Obviously, every country in Africa is different. Every country in Africa has its own regulations. But I think one common theme I see in a lot of different places is maybe there's restrictions on imports, there's restrictions on how much mini grids can charge, there's restrictions on who you can buy from, how much you can buy, where you can put it, what sort of land you can put it on. And I think in many cases, and we see this in let's say Pakistan, for example, where they had less restrictions. They just said, if you want to go build solar, go build solar. Less import tariffs, less taxes, less rules, less permits required. Because as soon as you have all these extra things, you just you give opportunities for things to get waylaid. So certainly looking forward to the conversation and happy to contribute more. But I think kind of the top for the first thing I would say is sometimes less is more.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think you've touched on a very sensitive aspect, which is across the continent, countries are at different stages of regulatory development, and this is also a very big challenge we are grappling with as a continent. And you've also mentioned the inconsistencies across countries, which I think Mr. Kabanda alluded to, that we should try to harmonize our regulations and standards. Okay, Mr. James.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yourself.
So my name is James Mand. I've been trying to bring the video, but I can't. So I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
We are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great. So my four colleagues have ably analyzed what needs to be done in Africa. So some of the issues may be a repetition of what has already been said. But the first thing that I want to point out is that we need to support distributed solar and storage. I think this is very important. We must shift away from a focus purely on these massive solar projects. We need to begin to look at, supporting off-grid and macro-grid systems, which are very critical for the development of rural areas. Yesterday, I said that most of Africa, other than the north, most of the sub-Saharan Africa is rural. 60% of the people stay in rural areas. So we must help them by supporting these distributed solar systems and also battery storage. The next thing is that we need to, we pointed out this yesterday and the other days, the nature of solar systems is that they are highly variable. Intermittency. Now, we need to build out grid systems that can manage this variable output, all right? And when we do this, we need to find other ways. We need to address this infrastructure gap, as grid integration is essential for scaling up our use of solar energy. We need to create, this has already been said, but we need to create a stable regulatory and financial environment. I think Africa, can unlock the necessary capital to harness its abundance, 60% of the world's best solar potential. But we need to work together with the World Bank, with the African Development Bank, with the Africa. I think there's something called the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the African Development Bank. We need to put together resources for regional cooperation. There are a lot of institutions, we repeat a lot of efforts in Africa. We are not coordinated. So we need, with the coming in of AFSEM, my sincere hope is that we can have a coordinating organization that, looks at how to, to manage the resources that are available. There's a lot of resource. The resource envelope, even if it's not, it's not infinite, but there is a resource envelope. But we need an organization, we need ourselves to come together in order to manage this resource envelope. Lastly, from me, is that, we have, this has been pointed out a lot of times, de-risk investment, implementing policy reforms that reduce the market risk to attract foreign direct investment and making financing more affordable. So de-risking can be done in a lot of ways. And I think that we have had the opportunity to listen to one of the presentations on the second day or first day on how we can de-risk these investments in Africa. So I think that in summarizing my submission, investments in solar must be accompanied by supporting distributed solar and storage. We must always include storage so that we do not have issues to do with the base load when the sun goes down. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and all my panelists. James also touched on key sensitive areas, which is least cost electrification. Least cost electrification. We need to electrify, but at what cost? The cost must be least. And he even gave further examples using distributed solar to electrify our countries and cities. He also touched on coordination and system stability. That's very good. And in all this discussion, all the thoughts shared by the 5 panelists point to one direction: regulation. Regulation is key. That is the trend that emerged from all that we've said. Regulation is key. The systems are already there. The technology is already there. The solar irradiation potential is there. How do we harness it efficiently? So regulation is very key in this discussion. So now, Florencia, to your personal question. In Africa, one thing is policies often look good on paper. We don't like the policies. And every country has the policies. But execution is where momentum is lost. So Florencia, from your practical experience supporting renewable adoption across the globe, where exactly does implementation break down?
So, what a tricky question, I would say. Africa is I deeply believe at a unique moment to skip traditional development stages and adopt newer approaches to drive social and economic prosperity. In the energy sector in particular, it has become evident that there is an opportunity to leapfrog fossil fuels in favor of renewables, and not only for electricity generation, but also for heating and transportation, and not only for environmental reasons, but also, and even more important, for economic and security reasons. So to do so, and as with any other long-term infrastructure, a sustainable solar development needs to be based on four main pillars, I could say: policy stability, regulatory transparency, sound contractual frameworks, and well-designed risk mitigation tools. Investors don't fear risk, they fear uncertainty. So the discussion is not only about what price investments can be made at, but also whether they can be made at all. So, and the reality is, not only in Africa, but in most developing countries, is that renewable energy policy is neither clear. We have bilateral negotiations, options, feed-in tariffs, implemented it simultaneously without any clear criteria, nor stable, because everything changes with government administration changes. So it's very important to stay and to respect contracts, not even no matter what, right? About transparency, simply do a quick search on the internet to see how many PPAs are publicly available. It is far from the norm. Obscure bilateral negotiations are still prevailing in many countries, with consequences that go well beyond the price, giving up a significant share of installed capacity to a single company. Not only comes at the risk to have a non-competitive price, but also, and also very important, at a high sovereignty cost. So that it's very important to be emphasized. About contractual frameworks need to be, I would say, precedent-proof. We need to move from political willpower, which is volatile, to institutional guarantees, which are stable. So contracts must be held over time. We are talking about PPAs with a tenure of 20 years. So that is equivalent to roughly 5 government administrations. So we really need to, 5 or 4, depending on the country, of course, we really need to respect the contract. And also, they need to be standardized and largely non-negotiable, because we are seeing in many, many countries that even under competitive bidding programs, they still have post-award negotiations. And that fact goes at the risk of losing transparency and also losing the advantage of the competition. We need that bidders price not only the risk, but also the guarantees. Everything should be embedded on the price, which is offered within a bid. And that's it. No, any post-award negotiation need to be handled after the opening of the bids, of the envelopes. So post-award negotiations in that sense should be avoided to promote transparency and equity. And finally, I would say that an essential condition for long-term investment is an effective risk allocation and mitigation tools through policy and financial tools. When I'm talking about policy tools, I'm referring to all the features that are included in the PPA to be bankable. For example, tapping rights, international arbitration, adequate adjustment factor to the price in case they are denominated in local currency, all the features that make a contract bankable, but that need to be complemented necessarily, as in most developing countries, with financial guarantees, well-designed financial guarantees. I'm not talking about satisfying all the requirements from the private sector without any rationale. We need to be very careful at the time of allocating risk between the parties to be equitable and to be transparent. So to me, of course, these two pillars, the policy tools and the financial tools, need to be hand in hand to make contracts bankable and energy prices affordable for the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Florencia. Thank you. You've really listed a number of things we have to address to ensure implementation doesn't break down. And I think all of them borders more on the regulatory aspects. Again, and one interesting thing you said is investors don't fear risk, but they fear uncertainty. And I think that's what we need in Africa, predictability. Our rules, our regulations must be predictable. Thank you. Let me bring in Caliste at this point. Let me bring Caliste in at this point. From your experience, do investors share the same thought as Florencia? Correct me if I'm wrong. I know investors don't invest in potentials. They don't invest in potential. They invest in predictability. So what signals do they see in the market that attracts them or that tells them that, oh, this market is stable and worth entering? So kindly share your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, no, you are right. Predictability is key because even when we are talking to different countries, to different regulatory authorities in the countries in Africa, when investors are coming to them, predictability is one of the issues they are looking for. For instance, how often the tariff is reviewed in a country. So the investor needs to have a clarity on the not only the frequency, but also the methodology followed in the tariff review, because that is one of the risks that may affect his investment. So predictability is key. But before maybe I elaborate more on this one, I like to start every time with a positive note. And I would like to give some key figures from our Electricity Regulatory Index report showing that although there are still some bottlenecks in the regulatory environment in Africa, but progress has been really made. So from our 2024 report, encouraging progress in terms of integration of renewable energy in energy supply in Africa has been recorded. For instance, 38 countries now in Africa have renewable energy procurement frameworks. We have 30 countries which guarantee grid access for renewables. 26 countries provide priority dispatch for least cost renewable energy. And national programs supporting standalone system exist in at least 24 countries. So you can see really we have made progress because I don't have sufficient time to show the evolution. since we have been tracking this since 2018. But furthermore, it has become very obvious that countries with stronger regulatory frameworks like Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, Rwanda, among others, have achieved faster electrification progress by combining, of course, grid expansion, mini-grid deployment, off-grid solutions. And for these, so far, 34 African countries have now such integrated electrification plan. So it's very encouraging. But to come back to your question, we still have some gaps, not only in terms of transparency, in terms of regulation, but we have also issues or gaps around tariff frameworks, grid connection protocols, and financing of a risk mitigation aspect. But in yesterday's discussion, where as you have as it has been pointed out in the summary of the last 2 days, it came out very clear that power sector regulators plays and have to play a critical role in the sector development. For instance, in enforcing least cost planning, facilitating private sector participation, and ensuring that utilities work toward financial viability, which is very critical for attracting investment, both public and private. So on the investment side, we need simplified licensing regimes, predictable tariff frameworks, targeted subsidies where necessary, and clear rules for integration of renewables in the main grid. Our electricity regulatory index report findings consistently show outcomes where tariff regulation is done by an independent regulator and where we have cost-effective methodologies and regulatory governance is predictable. It has shown so stronger outcome in the sector. So to conclude, maybe just providing what may be needed in the longer term, we need to move from policy intention to regulatory implementation. And our electricity regulatory index report provides clear roadmap and proposed actions for long-term, medium-term, and short-term for each participating country. Second point, integrated resource planning is key, especially where isolated solar projects foresee a full integration to the main grid system for future development of a grid. Third, we need harmonization of regulatory framework within regions, continental level, and I provided some clarity in my first intervention, whereby we are supporting regional regulators and the continental at the continental level. Finally, enhance the capacity at institutional level, but also in terms of skills development. So I am very sure if we work all together, we can make it this happen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Thank you, Calist. I think those were interesting interventions. And you talked about tariffs, cost reflective revenue requirement tariffs. You also touched on predictability, which has been running from the very first question, has been running through the very question to now. Predictability. Our regulations and policies must be predictable. Tariffs must be predictable. We also touch on the fact that we should move from policy intention to implementation, which is key, which is the main point of this discussion, a call to action. How do we move from the policy intentions to implementation? We also touch on harmonization, where we can try to pool resources together to have least cost electrification. We need to pool resources together, and we can only do that when we harmonize our regulations. And on that, I would like to invite Yaguba. You are the African Energy Commission, and there's this increasing emphasis on regional and continental coordination. but where and how does it genuinely accelerate progress? And where might it unintentionally hide some domestic weaknesses?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, our report shows that we foresee a kind of increase in terms of our renewable energy increase in the energy mix in Africa, especially when you talk about solar. Our study showed that by 2040 we'll witness up to 20% of electricity capacity increase from the solar. So actually, this is a big growth that we believe it can support Africa to address two of its main issues. One, with regard to energy, that is the access to electricity, but access also to clean cooking. But before we are able to achieve this, we need a kind of a scale which can only be achieved through a kind of paradigm shift. I think the first one is the issue of our policy and regulatory frameworks. I think that has been very well elaborated by my brother colleagues. Actually, as he said, we have several examples in Africa how a conducive environment, one that guarantees transparency, fair competition, and also cost reflective tariffs that can catalyze both investment from both public and private. One of the example is, for example, the Ghana, which has managed to evolve from unsolicited proposal on the feed-in tariff to energy auction, which is providing immense opportunity for investment in the continent. So actually, we need what we need in Africa is really a very clear procedure when it comes to licensing, when it comes to grid code. But also, secondly, the regional and continental market liberalization is very, very key, as this will facilitate the necessary systems to support increased intermittent capacity that we witness with renewable energy, while creating a larger market for electricity exchange. For instance, the integration would enable solar energy generated, let's say, from East Africa to also meet some demand in Central Africa. The third element is to strive to increase investment in the renewable energy project. I think Florencia also had a very good point in that regard. The fourth element that I want to mention is the issue of grid efficiency. Because in Africa, most of the country actually have weak electricity grids and also aging infrastructure. So we also need to invest in terms of infrastructure, in terms of grid efficiency, including the regional interconnectors. So that would leverage technology to build, for example, smart grids that allow for the uptake of more decentralized generation capacity. When you look at also transmission and also distribution utilities, we must elevate them to be a kind of to promote them as service providers, moving away from long-term power purchase agreement toward a real-time market pricing mechanism. So when you look at the continental electricity frameworks, actually they provide significant value by fostering cross-border trade and integrating diverse national systems, which enhance overall market efficiency and resilience. You may see some regions have excellent of power generation, while other regions do not have power. So with the African single electricity market that is spearheaded by the African Union, our goal is to create one of the biggest electricity markets in the world, actually, which will be serving all our member states, 55 of them. So we believe that by integrating regional markets with APSEM, we will be able to foster increased competition, expand demand to reduce market risk, but also enhance system security through a diverse technology mix into our systems, and also to optimize, to enable us optimize the grid support services, such as black starts and spinning reserves. So, but these markets that we are really pushing for it operationalization, as it has been elevated as one of the Agenda 2063 flagship projects, is drawing from the Continental Power System Master Plan, which is actually which actually is targeting to have to double the overall demand relative to the baseline conditions where we operate in silo. So instead of operating in silo, through this Continental Master Plan, we will be able to increase the service that we provide. So this continental framework should act as enablers, meaning that they should not be there to substitute national reforms. Their role is to provide shared standards and to set some norms and benchmarking systems to support regional coordination, data harmonization, and also ensuring data transparency, but also provide capacity support, including skill sharing among our institutions, among our countries. So they should not be there to target to replace national regulation. So the decisive transformation, however, must occur at national level, where regulations are implemented, where the contracts are signed and enforced, but also investments. It will also that where we see also the risk in terms of investment. So the continental framework should be there to guide the regional, the national regulations, but also to enhance the collaboration so that regulations are harmonized. That would facilitate the trade and also in cooperation, collaboration in the energy sectors among the African countries. That way we will see really addressing the issue of energy access gap on the continent, and to also share best practices among our African countries. So the regional, the continental framework would set the standards, the baseline that national agency will reflect on to have strong but harmonized national regulatory frameworks. Back to Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaguba. So what you are basically saying is harmonization works, but ownership must remain national. And also regional ambitions cannot replace domestic implementation. And you also touched on one thing you touched on, which Calist also touched on in there. There's progress in scaling solar, as we speak today, there has been some progress. And I think that's why there's the reason why sessions like this are organized to see this. So these are positive news for us that even this conference is going to help to scale it further. And on the things you mentioned about infrastructure, grid efficiency, and you also touch on the fact that most of our grid infrastructure are weak or obsolete. They've been there before some of us, our fathers, were even born, and they need to be replaced. But how do we replace them? When we are scaring away the investors, they said the investors don't fear the risk, they fear the uncertainty. So we need to move forward and ensure this, our regulations are quite stable and predictable for these investors. I also touched on the fact that we need to build a very strong market, regional market or continental market, which is very key. Do we want to keep the political borders? Do our electorals respect these borders? So we have to really look at this market. We have the regional pools and the rest. Do the electorals respect the borders? If they don't, how are we positioned to remove these borders? And all these are issues that regulation is positioned to address. So the main challenge we have, even regarding infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, grid efficiency, are all hinged on regulation. When we get our regulations right, we are able to define and design better policies for implementation. And on this, I would like to invite Alex to share his thought on something very peculiar in Africa. In Africa, we always hear of pilots, and we celebrate pilot projects a lot. But transformation happens when innovation becomes embedded in the system. So, Alex, what in your experience are the most important regulatory or market conditions that determine whether innovation in solar scales beyond pilots and becomes system-wide relevant?
Thanks so much, and my apologies. My internet's a little weak, so I've just switched to my phone. But yeah, there's a number of things. I think, and folks have talked a lot about a lot of fantastic things: the importance of consistency, reliability, the importance of least cost planning. So really proud to be part of this very esteemed panel, making a lot of great points and great ideas. I think one thing which yes, you need to be clear and consistent, but regulations also need to evolve. One of the examples I'd like to give is net metering regulations. If a country's at a very early stage of the solar journey, it makes sense to have net metering rules because you want to make it simpler for users, and they tend to be very favorable for people to put it on their home and reduce their electricity bills. At some point, though, when solar starts to hit 3, 5, 6, 10% of electricity generation, you can't have net metering rules anymore because you end up getting too much injection during the day, and the distribution utility is burdened by that extra generation during the day and is not properly compensated for it. So this is where grandfathering is really important. Let's say, when we're going to start something, maybe we're going to give a special incentive. Maybe it's a feed-in tariff. Maybe it's a net metering rule. Maybe it's some tax incentive for C&I customers to install solar, and then say, you know what, we're gonna once we hit this amount, or after 2 years or after 1 year, whatever it is, we're going to grandfather it out because we don't want to impose too much for costs in the discom. We're not going to grandfather it out. We're going to keep any system that was installed before December 31st, 2026 will be eligible for this incentive. Systems going forward will not be required. Another good example, someone mentioned storage. Always include storage. I'm a huge fan of storage. I really like storage. But maybe again, if it's an emerging, if we're just starting out in the solar journey, maybe we say only C&I users above 100 kilowatts need to install storage, and smaller systems, so MSMEs or rooftop solar, they're going to pay a small fee for grid balancing, but they're not going to have to install storage at their premises themselves if they don't want to. So yeah, I think in general, try to make things simpler. Let's have these pilots, but as we're moving from the pilot to the first commercial applications, we don't want to impose really, really burdensome regulations. And maybe that means, you know what, we want to have really stringent grid standards in terms of grid forming inverters and you know, fault ride through conditions for solar and wind projects to make sure that they're being responsible grid citizens and they're contributing to a really, really stable grid. But maybe we're going to say, you know what, projects under 5 megawatts, we're gonna exempt them from these regulations, or under 2 megawatts, or under some threshold, to say, you know what, if I want to install a new micro wind turbine, or I want to install a new type of solar, you know, I can do that without necessarily having to have a really big compliance burden, a really big regulatory burden. So yeah, I think using thresholds to kind of protect smaller players, you know, making sure that the regulations in general, whether it's the tax regulations, the import regulations, the land conversion regulations, either simplifying them or at the very least providing exemptions for systems under a certain size, because that's the only way we're going to get innovation and allow people to iterate and make mistakes and fail. And then once something is mature and once something is stabilized, once we have, you know, 500 megawatt solar parks, then we can start worrying more about how do we have, let's say, grid forming inverters to make sure that these solar parks are contributing to the stability of the grid. The last thing I'd say is, and someone, I think I mentioned this already, is but ending the fossil fuel subsidies. You know, the best thing Nigeria did for solar had nothing to do with solar. It was ending diesel subsidies. And when you end diesel subsidies and when you end coal subsidies and gas subsidies, a lot of these solar and storage starts to become more economic on their own, and you'll see people innovate on their own without necessarily needing strong government programs to support them. So yeah, I think clear, consistent rules, but that evolve, simplifying regulations and making exemptions, particularly for small systems, and either ending fossil fuel subsidies or better yet, reallocating the subsidies to clean energy systems. Those are kind of be the top three things I'd say for helping pilots move beyond pilots and become commercially mainstream.
And from your intervention, what I got is utilities pilots can actually transition into large-scale deployment, and that is very key, and that is what we looking forward to in Africa. But sometimes our utilities are not willing to accommodate this renewables into the grid. And Alex touched on it, that because when our regulations are not right, they may not be willing to do that. Especially maybe let's look at net metering. If the ratio is 1:1, obviously utilities will not be willing to accommodate solar home systems, grid-connected solar home systems, because it erodes their revenue. So regulation must step in to fix that error. And also, if we don't get the technicalities right, this integration of renewables poses a challenge to the grid. So obviously, the grid operators will not be interested. So regulations must come in to address that challenge. Thank you very much, Alex. So we now move to, so we've been talking about what regulations should be put in place to address the challenges from investor side to the grid, to the technical side. So Alex, just share your thoughts on what not to do. Because over the past 2 days, we've been exploring what regulation must do, and we've all agreed now that regulation is key to scale large-scale deployments. So the important question is, what should regulation avoid doing? So
Yeah,
in your view, what policy moves looks very attractive, but could rather undermine scale or efficiency?
Sorry, this for me or this is for someone else?
No, for James.
Oh, for James, sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, so here's the thing. You know, when we discuss all this, we talk about tariff affordability, we talk about regulatory uncertainties. We are limited as regulators to how far we can go in terms of regulatory uncertainty, because frequent policy changes are not brought about by the regulator himself or herself. Frequent policy changes, which of course have got the effect of discouraging long-term investment, is brought about the decision makers. Okay, in Africa, whenever there's a change of government, there's likely to be a change of policy, regulatory policy, and that brings about regulatory uncertainty. And also related to that, the regulator, I can assure you, being a regulator myself, I can assure you that they try as hard as possible to bring about the required the required tariffs that can bring that can allow the investor to recoup their investment. However, this tariff affordability, which in essence is just balancing investor returns with consumer affordability, it remains a big challenge in Africa. Like I said, 60% of the populations in most African countries live in rural areas. And so when we talk about tariff affordability, without a viable subsidy, we cannot talk about tariff affordability. And it will remain a challenge until governments decide to put in place targeted subsidy mechanisms. And there are very few countries that have in place targeted mechanisms in terms of how the poor will be taken care of. So these shall remain, they will remain a challenge. And I think the last one that I want to talk about is really the institutional capacity of most regulators. At continental level, we have got countries that are doing so well in terms of the capacity building. And I want to thank the African Development Bank in terms of their work that they do helping regulators understand the challenges. However, most countries remain without proper capacity building mechanisms. They do not have capacity building mechanisms in place. So, as a continent, we really need to work together. Okay? We really need to come together, especially continental institutions such as the African Development Bank, the African Forum for Utility Regulators, the AUC, and so on and so forth. We really need to come together and capacitate the institutions on the continent. So in summary, I wanted to talk about these regulatory uncertainties, but most of all, that we don't have, if we want to count on the continent, how many of our vertically integrated state utilities are viable? There are very few. Okay? So I want to be the advocate of independent, specialized, non-utility entities that can buy, sell, and in certain cases, transport energy to where it is needed. These are energy traders. Okay? We have energy traders in Zambia, and they are working very well. I think that there are other countries that have accommodated energy traders, and that's the way to go, because most of the state-owned vertically integrated utilities do not have the financial muscle. Up to now, there are very few utilities. There are very few, state utilities who are the off-takers that have the financial capacity to do so. So I want to advocate of policies that can allow these specialized non-utility entities to come into the market and do the buying and the selling, so that in the middle sits what we used to call the single buyer, who is essentially the state utility, and their role would be to charge willing charges to these specialized non-utility entities, the traders and the buyers, so that they can make a profit from the use of their facilities, such as the transmission networks. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. That was a good intervention. What regulators must not do. And you touch on tariff affordability and cost reflectivity. So what I got from your presentation is a regulator in an attempt to make tariff affordable may tend to set tariffs that are not cost recovery. And you are advising that regulators should not be seen doing that. And you are also advising that subsidies should be considered. That's cross subsidies. And actually, no tariff is cost reflective globally. There are cross subsidies embedded in them.
Yes.
But what regulators should not do is to discourage investors from coming into the market. Our tariffs must be stable over a long period of time to send the correct signals to the investors. You also touch on regulatory capacity. All our discussions from 2 p.m. till now has been on regulation. But do we have the capacity? Do we have the capacity to ensure that these regulations are implemented? Do we have even the capacity to know the regulations to put in place in our countries? And the answer is obviously no. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, institutions must invest in capacity building. Capacity building is very key because the energy landscape is so dynamic that you can't rely on old technology or old mindsets. You need to build capacity, and that capacity must be adaptable to the African context because we have peculiar challenges. And I think that's why the African School of Regulation is well positioned in this regard. And we have very, very innovative courses that are tailored to the African region, African context. That's integrated framework for electrification and also investment in private transmission. All these courses are there to build the capacity of regulators to think outside the box. That's the traditional way of doing things, so that we can attract the right investment into the region. Thank you. Let me now turn to the chat box and see if we have some questions for our panelists. Okay, there's one question here. How best can startups in the solar world scale up amidst the little hype in solar companies? Amidst the little hypes in solar companies. I don't know if Alex, you would like to take that?
Yeah, so I mean, we work with a lot of startups, including a handful in Africa as well. And I think, the key is to focus on a niche. I think sometimes people say, I'm going to save the world and I'm going to do everything, right? If your niche is, I'm going to serve, small shops, or I'm going to serve, white collar workers who are working from home and give them, solar plus storage sets to replace their petrol gen sets or the diesel gen sets. That's your USP. That's your market. Go for that. Do it in your home state. Do it in your home country. Find ways to differentiate.
try not to innovate everything at once. I've seen people, they're saying, okay, well, I'm going to build my own device, and I'm also going to do manufacturing, and I'm also going to do, manufacturing batteries, and I'm going to do micro wind, and I'm going to do biomass. And pick one thing you're good at and stick to that. Say, I'm going to provide solar storage systems cheaper than anybody else in my home state to this target market. I'm going to build a micro wind turbine, and I'm going to just sell the micro wind turbine to mini grid operators. Um, but yeah, I think one of the biggest things I see with startup founders is they try and do too much, and then they end up not having the capacity to do it. So pick one thing and get really really good at it.
Yes, thank you, Alex. I don't know if Calist, you want to give your thought on that question as well.
No, what was the question again? Sorry, just to be sure I got it right.
Okay, how best can startups in the solar world scale up amidst the little hike in solar components?
No, that is too technical. But for me, what I have realized with the little I have engaged with solar, but also in general, the renewable energy developers, really, you have to be very innovative enough to optimize your cost so that you came up with interesting tariff. At the end, all the discussion you will have with the country or with any off-taker, the tariff will be key determining factor. So what I think is whatever you can do, if you can optimize your cost to come up with an affordable tariff, you will be successful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Calist. Let's move on to the second question. What is the existing gap that requires capacity building to close that gap? I think I would like James to comment on this because you spoke about capacity building.
Yes. Okay, so this is an anonymous attendee. I think that we are moving into technological advancement space, and the use of AI, drones, and a lot of other technological advancements. The regulator cannot escape without having to be aware of what it requires as a regulator to implement these new technologies. For example, I think that we know about a lot of countries are now using drones to just fleet of transport. For example, you can you can do conditional monitoring, you can do driver behavior, you can manage a lot of things just from the use of AI. Now, if the regulator has remained behind and he is not capacitated in understanding the use of technology in regulation, then we'll have a situation whereby the regulator is so much behind, and the utilities know so much, and we create what we call the information asymmetry between the regulator and the regulated. So I think it's very important for regulators to be in the forefront of building their capacity. Of course, it's going to be expensive. It will require a lot of funding, but I think it's one thing that must be done in order to minimize the gaps between the regulator and the regulated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. And I think sometimes the gaps are country specific. So in that case, you may need to do a needs assessment sometimes for the regulator, and identify where there are gaps. But broadly, the gaps we have in Africa is we need investors. We need investors to develop our energy sector. And how do we get them? It all relies on regulation. So each regulatory institution has to look at how best they want to incentivize this investment and where they lack the capacity, and they should not shy away from it. They should not shy away from it. They have to make it known and seek capacity building. And this is very key, because regulation always comes with a long-term cost. If you don't do it today, you may not pay the price today, but it's a long term, it will come and hit you back very strongly. That's why the regulators have to stand on their grounds and build the right capacity to assure development of the sector. Okay, let me see if we have any other questions. Okay, we do not have any questions anymore. So maybe I'll just ask for the final reflections from our panelists. This is your final reflection in one sentence. What principles should guide regulation across African power sectors? So let me start with Florencia again. What principles should guide solar regulation in the African power sectors?
I would say, as closing remarks, that, and also in relation to the last discussion that was very insightful, I think planning, long-term planning, and institutional capacity are the two main areas where capacity building is needed, because if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. So to have an IRP, a least cost generation plan, that is something very, very important, because you need to know how much capacity do you need, where, and of what type, firstly, and then move on building the political will to create a policy that is credible and is sustainable over time, and to not carry on multiple procurement types at the same time. So the investors need clarity. So if you are going toward auctions, stay there and build upon there the capacity to design the contracts, to implement them. That is something that we do at RELP together with the government. We work hand in hand with them to allow them to have like local ownership on those capacities, to allow them to carry on their own processes onward. So we don't want to be the ones doing everything, but help governments to learn how to do things, to be the owners of the whole process, as it should be. So I would emphasize that planning and institutional capacity are really among the different capacity building that of course could be provided, the two main ones to move forward with credible and sustainable procurement programs. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Florencia. Mr. Calist, can you just give us your final reflections?
Yeah, you said, if I understood well, in one sentence, which is, yeah, it's possible, but it will be very high level. So in one sentence, I would say the principle should be actually not only the principle, but also the aim should be having clear, predictable, and transparent regulation, including on energy storage regulation, conducted by an independent regulatory institution. So this is how I would, wrap up in one sentence, because we have seen the predictability of regulation and the transparency of the regulation is very key. But also we have seen energy storage is key to support the deployment of solar energy in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Calist. Then Yaguba.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I would like to request that you allow me to give you two sentences instead of one, because
that's fine. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your generosity. No, I want to say one sentence on the issue of capacity building. Actually, the issue of capacity or lack of capacity or capacity gap is very diverse in Africa, because we have differences among regions, we have differences among countries. So we came to that conclusion with a very elaborated study that we did in terms of assessing the capacity gap in Africa in the energy sectors. And that helped us to come up with a very comprehensive capacity building program, which not only include trainings, I commend the work that ASR is doing in that regard. And we launched a kind of a platform, a continental platform, where we promote exchange of expertise and experiences among African institutions. Because I think that, that to second what Florencia had said, because the institutional capacity is very, very key to address our regulation issues. What we notice is that African institutions are afraid to give opportunity even to the youth, because when you look at our institutions in Africa, and the number of people working in those institutions with the magnitude of the work that they should do, you will imagine that those people are like robots. So I think one thing that we need to give opportunity to our youth, to give them even internship opportunities, so that we strengthen our institutional capacities. And the platform that we launched, and we thank ASR, we developed that with the African School of Regulation. This capacity building tools or platform will be launched very, very soon. And we believe that it will help really to address the capacity gap on the continent. And my final word to say is to say that the regulation that we develop must prioritize system sustainability over short-term expansion, ensuring that every new solar investment that we put would strengthen the reliability, the affordability, but also the financial viability of the entire power sector in Africa. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Yakuba. On a lighter note, that was more than two sentences. Okay.
Yeah.
Before Alex, a final reflection.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that solar and even solar plus storage is already economic pretty much across the continent. And so in general, regulations should be about getting out of the way, making it easier, making people to buy solar, making people easier for people to build it, to implement it, to innovate around it. So yeah, in general, there's lots of different nuances to it, but try and make things simpler, not more complicated with adding thickets of regulation. And best of luck to everyone.
Okay. Thank you. James?
Yes, I think my final take is two issues. The first issue is the utility scale versus distributed solar. I think these are very important. I made a submission that countries in the North Africa, they have managed their large scale solar systems very well. However, in the sub-Saharan Africa, where populations are sparse, we need to emphasize distributed solar coupled with, we need to focus on the distributed solar. We focus on the off-grid solutions, and also we need to remember the the fact that we need to put battery storage. The second one is institutional coordination. A lot of efforts are being put into Africa. However, the result at the end of the day is minimal because we have got these efforts are appreciated, but they are fragmented because we do not have proper institutional coordination across the continent to coordinate finance, to coordinate efforts, to coordinate regulatory frameworks, and so on and so forth. So we hope that we can do this this year going forward so that we can achieve the best results. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I think that's the final panelist. And before we conclude the session, let me just offer a brief synthesis of the key insights shared over the past 2 days, and in particular in this session. We have 4 messages standing out. First, the barriers to scaling solar in Africa are no longer technological. They are institutional and regulatory. As we've all said, Africa does not lack the potential or proven technology. What we need is a framework capable of unlocking it at scale. Secondly, credibility and predictability matter more than elaborate designs, experimental works, pilots. Investors respond to stable rules, clear risk allocation, and disciplined implementation. Thirdly, incremental fixes will not be enough. What is needed is a coherent, long-term regulatory vision that aligns planning, procurement, grid integration, and financial sustainability. And the 4th point that ran through almost all the sessions is capacity building. We've all realized that capacity building in this regard is very key to unlock the potential in the sector. So this brings us to the end of our discussion, and I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for a rich and insightful discussion, and all the participants for your engagement and attention throughout the session. Thank you very much. I will now hand the floor back to Ken.
Thank you very much, Lutifafa. And also thank you very much our distinguished panelists for a forward-looking and substantive exchange. As we conclude this conference, we will now hear formal closing remarks from our partner and co-organizer of this conference, the International Solar Alliance. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Ishan Rohit, who is a program specialist Star C at the ASR, to share closing reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope I am audible to you.
Yes, yes, you are.
So I have been given, I will say, the easiest job to say thanks in closing remarks. But I'm very happy to see my colleague Alex, who is in the panel. We have been together with the International Finance Corporation, and I'm sure that he has been giving some very good upsides of the solar and battery storage techno-commercial feasibility. Before I start my closing remarks, because I have been working in this sector since last, I will say, 25 years. I think for African countries, because I was going through a lot of reports, there is a comparison, okay, commercial market have achieved this much of gigawatt, Africa is this much of gigawatt. I don't think so. African countries need to be a part of any specific rat race. But I think this is the right time for Africa because most of the risk for commercialization of solar power are mitigated. Technologies are matured. Business models are matured. In commercial world or emerging markets, regulations are matured. So all sort of transactions are happening. With respect to Africa, the good things are we are having abundant resource, GHI. Technology, I mentioned that that is now having minimum risk. Grid integration might be a challenge. And we need to see that what best business model could be adopted in the country. Way back, I think 2 decades back, when I was doing research, and people, all panelists, all big seminars, I was used to hear that okay, technology will drive the agenda. But honestly speaking, in today's scenario, where worldwide 2 cent, 3 cent tariffs are achieved, of course, regulation will drive the agenda. So if we can adopt the best regulation, which is meaningful for the African countries, I'm sure that there will be a success story. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers, esteemed moderators, honored guests, and participants from across the globe, as we draw this remarkable 3-day conference to a close, it's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of International Solar Alliance and the African School of Regulation ASR. Over the past days, we have collectively explored some of the most pressing regulatory, financial, and technical questions shaping the future of solar energy in African power sector. Your presence and active engagement have made this dialogue not only rich, but genuinely impactful. At the outset, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to African School of Regulation, particularly Dr. Abdul Qadir Shatima, for his leadership and co-hosting this important gathering. ASR's commitment to developing regulatory capacity on the continent has been evident throughout this conference, and it has been an honor to collaborate so closely. A special word of appreciation goes to Mr. Ashish Khanna, Director General of International Solar Alliance, for his inspiring opening address that set the tone of our discussions. His message understood that urgency and opportunity of accelerating solar deployment across Africa and the virtual role of sound regulation in unlocking this potential. We are deeply grateful to all moderators and panelists who shared their invaluable insights. From the opening session on the current landscape of solar PV in Africa to the detailed discussions on removing regulatory barriers, enhancing grid integration, and envisioning a long-term strategic pathway, each of you has contributed expertise that will help inform policy, investment, and capacity building efforts across the continent. We also sincerely acknowledge the hundreds of participants who joined the online from across and beyond. Your questions, comments, and reflections have enriched every panel and demonstrated the widespread commitment of advancing solar energy development at scale. To the organizers team at ISA, ASR, and other technical support partners, thank you for your meticulous planning, seamless coordination, and dedication behind the scenes. The conference would not have been possible without your hard work. This is not the end. It is the beginning of continued engagement. ASR will share the summary of key findings, and we look forward to our upcoming follow-ups activities, including deeper dives through interviews, podcasts, and focus debates. Together, we will continue to build a regulatory foundations and human capacity needed to transform Africa's energy landscape. On behalf of ISA and ASR, thank you once again for your time, your expertise, and your commitment. We look forward to work ahead and to meeting again in future forums dedicated to shaping a sustainable solar-powered future Africa. Last but not the least, I was listening some specific remarks from the panelists on the capacity building. So as you know that ISA is having its maximum solar energy technology application center, which we usually mention Star C in Africa, Ghana, Uganda, Somalia. I think more than 5 or 6 centers are there, and we are opening more. So as far as any capacity building related requirement is there, we will be happy to host and we will be happy to conduct specific programs on capacity buildings with respect to regulatory and policy. So thank you very much, and I wish you best of luck. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for those remarks and for ISA's continued partnership and leadership. Now, yes, I would like to invite Dr. Abdul Qadir Shetima, the director of the African School of Regulation, to deliver the final remarks and formally close the conference.
Thank you very much, Keno. Dear colleagues, I'm sorry my internet is unstable, so I'm not putting on the camera. But as we conclude this conference, allow me to thank all speakers and participants for the depth and quality of the discussions. I would like to respond before closing to Nutifafa's question on what regulators must not do to enable solar deployment and integration. I will answer that by summarizing what our expert panelists have said over the 3-day sessions. In a nutshell, regulators must not create regulatory uncertainty. They must not over-regulate, especially for small-scale and off-grid markets, or delay grid access and interconnection approvals. Also, regulators must not ignore grid integration and system planning. Colleagues mentioned the issue of IRP very clearly. They must also not undermine utility financial sustainability by suppressing tariffs without effective subsidy mechanisms. Also, has been mentioned, utility regulators must not crowd out private investment through opaque procurement practices. And finally, as clearly mentioned by James and Florencia, they must not ignore capacity building. The African School of Regulation will remain committed to strengthening regulatory capacity across the continent, supporting institutions, facilitating peer learning, and helping translate policy ambitions into practical implementation. In summary, solar energy offers Africa an opportunity not only to expand access, but to drive economic transformation. Therefore, our task now is to convert dialogue into action. So thank you for your commitment, your partnership, and your leadership over these 3 days. I really enjoyed it, but the work now continues. So thank you very much, and over to you, Keno.
Thank you very much, Director. So on behalf of the organizing team, I would like to thank all the speakers, moderators, our partner, the ISA, and participants for your engagement over the past 3 days. The insights shared during this conference will inform ongoing analytical work and future capacity building efforts aimed at strengthening regulatory practices across the African power system. We deeply appreciate your time and contributions. With that, this conference is formally concluded. Thank you, and we look forward to the continued dialogue. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.